Well, we're going to begin, and I'm recording this for those of you who are not able to join us today. And as if you've been with us in the past several months, we've had a few weeks off, but if you've been with us going back, stretching now almost maybe 10 months, we've been going over a series of books by Walter Brueggemann. This one is called Delivered into Covenant, Pivotal Moments in the Book of Exodus, Part 2 by Walter Brueggemann. And today's chapter is chapter 7, which has the playful title of Priests Down to Tippy Toes. And the pivotal text is Exodus chapter 29, verse 20. And we'll just dive right in. The pivotal text is, and I quote, "You shall slaughter the ram and take some of its blood and put it on the lobe of Aaron's right ear, and on the lobes of the right ears of his sons, and on the thumbs of their right hands, and on the toes of their right feet, and dash the rest of the blood against all sides of the altar." Now, I've got to say, that is not what I remember at all from my ordination. And some you, Nancy, probably were there, and others watching this may perhaps have been there as well. There was no rubbing of blood on my earlobes or my thumb or my toe. But I ask you to set aside for a moment the bizarreness of the ritual here described to get to the underlying point, which is the holy God will find a way of manifesting, being embodied in the community. And the vessels or conduits for God will be ritualistically purified and set apart to show that they represent a God who is holy in God's entirety. And that's the gist, the deep meaning behind the ritual. And so while we find this ritual in particular grisly, bloody, and off-putting, what's happening here is symbols and rites that would have been understood in its time and in its place are being applied. This would not have been the elements of this ritual very likely would have had antecedents in surrounding tribes and other peoples. And so they're not creating these things out of whole cloth, but they're trying to, through ways that this culture understands, find ways of teaching the people that there are certain persons and places, as it relates to the tabernacle, that are set aside and designated as the conduits, as the channels through which God will sojourn with, be embodied in the community. And these rites and rituals, when properly performed, are said to be efficacious. And we don't know why, and it doesn't matter how. We're not told what are the logistics of this particular ritual. Why does putting blood on the earlobe and the thumb? None of that matters, and none of that is explained. What matters is that God has made a way to persist with the people, to be embodied in the community. Brueggemann writes on page 88 of the Kindle version of this, "We are offered no explanation for the act of ordination, how it works, why it works, or the way in which it works. It's simply performed, and the performance is known to accomplish its purpose." So I bring that up to emphasize the fact that its working has nothing really to do with the people who go through the ritual. It all has to do with the God who promised to show up by way of the ritual, by way of the practice, by way of these traditions. It's like a grace that comes at us in one direction that only requires us to show up, more or less. The assumption, quoting Brueggemann from page 86 of the Kindle version, the assumption of this text is that God is utterly holy. That's a given. Of a different quality and character from anything in ordinary life. And for that reason, God requires a habitat that is pure, clean, well-ordered, and beautiful. All qualities that were lacking in the delusion, disobedience of Israel. The text articulates in God's speeches addressed to Moses what God requires in order to be present in Israel. So the directives are given for the creation of a tabernacle, a portable home for a holy deity. And this is no common tent, but is rather a beautifully, intricately designed space fit for a God who is holy and good. Next, the instructions are given for preparing someone to enter this tabernacle. Brueggemann writes, because this God requires a carefully considered holy place, not just anyone can come there. Indeed, this is not a place for the gathering of the congregation. Only very special, well-qualified persons can enter there, namely priests. Now, the priest there's three marks of the priesthood that Brueggemann wants to highlight here about this person designated as priest, that signified by this bizarre ritual of putting blood on the earlobes, the thumb, the toe, etc. Which, by the way, is only meant to emphasize from top down, this priest is being proclaimed holy. That's there's nothing particularly special about the earlobe or the thumb or the toe, but it's just, from the top of the body, from the head to the, or as Brueggemann playfully entitled this chapter, to the tippy toes, the priest is proclaimed holy. And one of the marks of the priest is that it's a person set apart from the people, and is holy just as God is holy and set apart. The second thing about the priest is that the set apart is signified by a dramatic, visible, and aesthetic and sacramental process. The priest is seen and shown to be set apart in grandeur befitting the beauty of God's holiness. And I included this picture of what we think a priest would dress up as. And all of this garb was meant to signify the distinctiveness and the holiness of the priest, which is only meant to reflect the distinctiveness and holiness of God. That's something that's often lost in this discussion, because I think it's all a way of puffing up the priest, but really all of these things were meant to emphasize the point that, yeah, the priest is a vessel and set aside to the purpose, but the priest is not what matters here so much as the holy God they represent. And there's nothing here of a moral expectation or educational preparation or competence and performance that's assumed from the part of the priest. The accent is thus on being, who the person existing as priest, rather than the doing of the priest. This is a long way of saying that the priest is designated as holy, not because of some personal achievement or merit, but by way of the ritual itself. The person's attributes don't matter so much as the role filled, which is why this was a role that was held within the house of Levi, and the high priests were to come from the lineage of Aaron. And so it wasn't so much what you did, it was that you were born into it, because who you were in this role didn't matter so much, or what you did in this role, or your actions in this role didn't matter so much as what the role symbolizes. And so you find priests in the Bible time behaving very poorly at times. And this is very upsetting to us from our own modern sensibilities, where so much emphasis is placed on the individual in the office as opposed to the office itself. And that's the next point that I'm wanting to make. The priest's role does not hang on the priest's positive personal attributes or lack thereof, but the priest is responsible to make sure that proper sacrifices are made and rituals are observed. This model of priesthood is compared to other models in the Torah that seem less rigid and more adaptable. And this point is made in the following quote. Brueggemann writes on 91, the Aaronide priesthood, the one being described here, is authorized by Moses, but seems in subsequent times to have been a rival to that of Moses. So we're dealing with two different literary traditions here. While the Torah interpretation of the Levites is open to endless reconsideration, there is something like closure, permanence, and fixity in the Aaronide priesthood that is quite in contrast to the dynamism of the interpretive tradition of Moses. Thus, Moses and Aaron, presented as brothers, are lead representatives of two impulses in Israelite faith, one toward open-ended development and the other toward the settled presence of a perpetual embodiment. These two impulses are best represented in our modern times by comparing most Protestant Christian traditions that tend to be open-ended and in development, with other traditions such as Catholicism and Orthodoxy, which tend to, like the Aaronide priesthood that we read about here, tend to have this settled sense of finality to their beliefs, that they're locked in stone, and they make subtle adaptations, but they're far less fluid and adaptable than the Protestants have shown themselves to be. And as for we disciples, we are fluid and adaptable, and then some. I mean, we pride ourselves in coming from a tradition that first eschewed the concept of priesthood, and now we have pastors which operate something like a priest, sort of, and we even ordain them, but we really want to tell people that we are a priesthood of believers. And so I bring that up to point to this spectrum, or these two approaches to the religious life. One, as described in today's chapter, which is very rigid, prescriptive, and has a high emphasis on first the holiness of God, but then as embodied in the presence of a priest set aside for the purpose. And then a more fluid faith, which is also represented in the Torah, almost juxtaposed with the model that we read about in this chapter, and in the chapters 25 through 30 of the book of Exodus, where they pivot and they change depending on the context. And I'd say that's more in line with the way Protestants behave. So Protestants have developed or adapted rituals and traditions to suit their own specific context, as I've been saying. And in the Western world, these things were often done in conflict with Catholicism, which has maintained a more rigid, less adaptable practice and along with the rituals and traditions. And speaking as a Protestant, I can tell you that we have become so reactionary and critical of the Catholic model, or the model that is represented in today's chapter, that we have failed to appreciate its merits. And Brueggemann in this chapter names this tendency. He says, it is easy enough in belated Protestant tradition to critique this priestly tradition, perpetual liturgical efficacy, because it can be refined and absolutized in destructive ways. And he has here in mind, I included here a picture of Martin Luther as an example of the ways in which a rigid hierarchical structure with defined roles and rules, where it doesn't matter about the attributes or morality of the priest, etc. It runs into problems, exploitation and corruption. And here we have, a mythological telling of the story of Martin Luther as represented in this picture, where he nails the 95 thesis to the wall to say all the ways in which he believes this model has led to problems. We're so used to that. It's kind of in our wheelhouse as Protestants to critique that, is what Brueggemann is trying to say. But he's wanting to go on to say, alongside that relatively obvious critique, however, we may take the opportunity to nevertheless appreciate the gain of such a theological trajectory. In the dangerous moments of the exile, when historical contingencies seemed to threaten everything in Israel, the priestly traditions proceeded with great imagination to formulate a vision of covenantal relatedness that would persist to perpetuity beyond the threats and vagaries of historical upheaval. In short, a religious community that echoes the Aaronite priesthood has, as described in Exodus, has much to commend it. Because, one, the priestly office is not held because of, but in spite of, personal merit. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my own. Okay, let me start that over. The Aaronite priesthood, as described in Exodus, has much to commend it. One, because the priestly office is held not because of, but in spite of personal merit, the clerical role is less likely to become a cult of personality. Protestants are notorious for churning out religious movements and communities that center around one charismatic personality. When the charismatic leader leaves or dies, the religious community struggles to continue to survive. You have less of that in a structure that has as its leadership positions persons where we don't expect them to be the focus, but rather the office that they hold. And so when there's a scandal in the church, my Orthodox brother, my biological brother who's converted to Eastern Orthodoxy, always wants to step in and remind me that in his tradition, that doesn't matter half so much, because and people are not thrown into so much because they never expected that their priests would behave any better or worse than other people. They're just the conduits, the vessels that are set aside for the purpose. It is the ritual and the practice and the liturgy and the Eucharist that matter. And as long as you have somebody who has been properly designated to fill that role, then you can plug in someone else and take them out. It'll never become a cult of personality. And then when moral failings get in the way, the community doesn't crumble because it doesn't hang on the integrity of one specific individual. Which leads pretty easily into the next point. Because the priest is caretaker of age-old traditions that the priest did not create, there is a timeless nature to the rituals that transcend market trends and transitory cultural shifts. This better points to a God who is bigger than and unmoved by the whims and fancies of fickle humanity. So when I attend my brother's Orthodox parish, what I appreciate is that I'm receiving a liturgical practice or a liturgy, and I'm reading along with them, and I'm observing different rituals that more or less happen around me, and I can engage them or not engage them depending on my mood or how they speak to me. But I'm relieved that I'm not being sold something. So because when I go to some Protestant churches, it's very obvious that they're employing the tricks of marketing, the tricks of the marketing trade to make the message more compelling, or to have a more attractive model, that it seems to be trying to keep up with trends in marketing that sell our products or consumer products, and religion is trying to adapt to keep up with the consumer culture in that way. And I can feel that I'm being pandered to, and I can sense that I'm in some ways being manipulated to buy into the message. And you don't get that sense when you're sitting in an Orthodox church or a Catholic church, where you simply receive the Eucharist, receive the liturgy, and then you leave. You can engage it wholesale, or you can just be a warm body in a seat. It's up to you, but you never feel like you're being pushed into anything. And I appreciate that as well. The prescriptions given in this part of Exodus regarding the priesthood and the tabernacle gave the Israelites ways of maintaining their sense of identity and connection to God, even during prolonged periods of exile and oppression. When the temple was torn down by an invading army, they would remember that there was a time when the people carried the house of God with them, setting it up where they could, a portable dwelling place for the Holy One. When the temple was destroyed, liturgical life in Israel transitioned to the synagogues. The Aaronite priesthood has by and large faded. Now rabbis function as leaders and interpreters of the faith, as they have done more than 2,000 years. Today's pivotal text can shore us up in an age of constant flux and change. It assumes a holy and other God who will always find ways to exist with and be embodied in our communities of faith. Our religious rituals and practices of ordination can provide continuity between us and our past. These rituals and practices can sit outside of modern trends and fashions and keep us anchored in a reality beyond our corporeal existence. Next class will be August 18th. So you notice I'll be out of town next week for my mother-in-law's funeral. Then we'll have a class in 2 weeks. And again, I apologize for the lack of continuity. I know we've been skipping lots of different weeks, but that week we'll be going over chapter 8, which is called The Dwelling Emancipator. But in the meantime, just me and you, Nancy. I'll bring us back. And as I was going over that presentation that I put together over the course of 2 days, and I still feel like I don't quite have a grasp on this.
Well, that was super helpful.
It was. I'm glad.
Yes.
I'm glad. And this I came through in the presentation, but there is a lot that I think that we in disciple land, meaning our own present tradition, could learn from this model. And I don't want to adopt it wholesale, right? I don't like rituals being seemingly arbitrary. I don't like the fact that persons can be designated as authorities just because, regardless of who they are. But our extreme is one where it's very easy to fall into cults of personality and to get trapped in endless cycles of keeping up with consumer trends. And my brother's tradition, the Orthodox tradition, or the Catholic tradition, which models closer to this model that we're talking about from Exodus. They don't do animal sacrifices and things like that, but they have hard and fast rituals that are practiced. I mean, it's a big deal to even change the language that they're spoken in. In the Greek Orthodox tradition, some churches will only speak in Greek. Vatican II is controversial for Catholics, but aside from those just very, what I think of as small shifts, they keep it all prescriptive, and that has the advantage of not being manipulative and also anchoring the community to the past in ways that I feel we lose in Protestantism, where we can feel unmoored from the past as every new decade or every new generation brings in new changes or interpretations. So I was trying to express an appreciation for what I think disciples could glean from in high church traditions even today, as they echo the priesthood that we were reading about. Does that all make sense?
Yes. Although I wonder, when you go to one of those churches like Catholic or Orthodox, you're just going through the ritual, but I guess you have to learn whatever you're going to learn outside.
Well, this is what I tell my brother have lots of discussions about this. And what I tell him is, without explanation, these rituals are inaccessible to about everyone else who's not Orthodox. And it's just like today in the passage today, the ritual of rubbing blood on earlobes, that'll never happen in my church. Okay. Like, and it's not gonna, and because if I thought people would see that and understand what was intended by it in an obvious way, well, then I'd be using the language of my time and culture to, the symbols, the understood symbols of my time and culture. But that doesn't translate. And what the Orthodox answer is a year plus of catechism,
Mhm.
where before he became a communicant, he spent a significant amount of time in conversation with his priest and going through classes and learning about all of this. Even received a new name in the process, his chrismation name, when he was chrismated is the term. I went to his chrismation service. And so he would want, I think, speaking for my brother, and maybe he'd correct me, but he would say, well, it's too bad that no one understands what we're doing here, but we have a catechism and this stuff is so valuable, we still will not change it. Like, we're not going to, they believe that that the liturgy they have received, the words spoken and orders in which things are done and on what days to do them is comes from the same source of inspiration as the scriptures and all the other traditions.
Mm-hmm.
You don't change it. You change it at your peril. And only way you could change it would be with a consensus of Orthodox bishops globally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In a council where it was voted on, whatever the it would be.
Well, I suppose they still have opportunities outside church to study and so on.
Well, people who end up with Orthodoxy, if my brother's an example, but I have two other friends who converted to Orthodoxy, and they have a very active interest in reading about their faith outside of their church time. Most of the time, if my brother puts together a list of things like Christmas present suggestions, there's usually a half dozen Orthodox books on there of things he's wanting to read about.
Well, interesting. Very interesting. One of the members at IUPUI is a Coptic Christian. And he's from, I learned Coptic means Egyptian.
Yep.
That's one thing I've learned from him. And he's super religious. And of course, they got different dates for their holidays and so on. And anyway, he in the Egyptian Christian church is persecuted right now. They're burning churches and all that stuff. And so I remember he came in to talk one day about Morsi, that
the singer.
No, Morsi was
Mohammed Morsi, Morsi. Wow, what a mistake to make. Especially the context was all right there. I know who you're talking about.
Yeah. He came in to talk about him and what he felt about him. I guess they were persecuting Christians, and he still has family back in Egypt and so on. But anyway, he said, I really hope they execute him.
Well,
anyway, I mean, he's got some interesting ideas about things, but I did go to one of their events, and a lot of icons in that church, very similar to what we have.
The Orthodox Church and the Coptic Church are very closely aligned. In fact, they are in frequent dialogue about ways to see one another as the same communion. There are some Coptic books that are included that are not in the Orthodox canon, which is more expansive than our Protestant or even the Catholic canon. But it's very similar to Orthodoxy, and I don't think I'm misspeaking in saying that the Orthodox communions recognize the Coptic communions as having the real presence of Christ in their communion. I'd better look that up before I
have their own hope in that Coptic. church.
I believe that the Orthodox Church recognized the Coptic communion. Does Orthodoxy recognize? I know they recognize the Catholic communions. Coptic. Does Orthodoxy? Getting a lot of stuff about comparisons. I just want to know a quick answer. But anyway, my brother feels more affinity with the Coptic Christians than he does with even Protestants, to give you. So whether or not that last thing is true about the community, which I believe it is, from the Protestant end, the circles that I swim in, I spend a lot of time listening to radio programs that take interest in persecuted Christians worldwide. And when the Coptic Christians are persecuted, they make mention of that and try to rally other Christians to care and to have concern for these other Christians. But if they're not talking about persecution of Coptics, then they're being talked about as heretics. So I just find that
interesting.
And heretics that in some people's view may not be going to heaven. Maybe their heresy is leading them straight to hell. And I think that's just the juxtaposition between these two ways of talking about a community from the same source. People that knew me growing up, adults.
You just froze up. Are you there? Well, Heath, you're frozen.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you're back.
Oh, did I break up?
You were frozen for a little bit, for a few seconds.
No.
It's all right.
Oh, okay.
It's kind of interesting. But this is a very interesting idea. And also, he says in this chapter that the Moses priesthood instead of the Aaronite one, the Moses one is different.
You wouldn't get that from this text, because this goes back to our discussion about different literary sources and traditions woven into the Torah. And the priestly tradition comes through. You're reading priestly stuff when it talks about the rites and rituals with such precision, where down to the cubit that you measure the walls on, the length of the altar. They are the priestly literary scribal tradition is preoccupied with right and proper order, as opposed to other places where he broadly describes in this chapter as the Mosaic tradition that reads as more adaptable, circumstantial. And the way that he also made the point in the opening paragraphs of this chapter that what we're reading here is likely come from a later scribal tradition, when written during maybe the 600s BCE, when the people were in exile. And taken in that context, you can see the function of these instructions. Even though the people in exile are not going to reestablish a priesthood and start sacrificing animals, the temple is destroyed. They are given a story that teaches them that even in the desert, God will make a way of covenanting with them and being embodied in their community. And so somebody in exile might read this story and be like, well, I don't know if it's really feasible for us to build even the tabernacle, but there was once a tabernacle and the people carried the presence of God with them.
Right.
What do we do now? And there you see them sliding into what would be better described as the Mosaic tradition, as Bergman talked about, one that was adaptable. And I'd say that's more in line with the rabbinic traditions of today. It's become the main practice of Jewish people, by and large, across the globe through the past 2,000 to going on 3,000 years, to adapt and to reinterpret and to have develop traditions alongside other traditions. And that's the Protestant way, it seems. I just think that Protestants have become so adaptable that we feel, I think, unmoored from history. It's hard to establish rituals that are understood by children and grandparents alike if you're always reinventing the wheel as to how you gather. So I'm as a pastor, I'm envious of a model where I would just receive what we offer and best as I'm able present that to people. But I've learned that that may be an appealing idea to me, but I think the challenge of our day is people don't gather at those sorts of things either. So
well, the church I went to on Sunday is supposed to be interdenominational to this really fancy neighborhood, which is close to this one, but we're in that neighborhood. Anyway, it's called Piedmont. And this church has been there for 100 years, and it's got all kinds of, beautiful wood carvings and stained glass. It's quite lovely. But anyway, the minister is a Presbyterian, and it just seemed that, except there was no communion, it just seemed to me just like one of our services. I know the songs. I mean, everything was.
Well, the Presbyterian Church USA and the Presbyterian Church, broadly speaking, in the Restoration movement, we're cousins, the disciples, and there's a reason why so much of that resonated.
Yeah.
So much.
Yeah, I felt very comfortable in that church, but hopefully I didn't catch something by going. I mean, they all wore a mask and all that, but I don't know. Anyway.
Well, I'm gonna keep you on, Nancy, but I'm gonna end the recording just because.
Okay.
Let's just but for those of you who watched to this point, we will be not meeting next week. We'll be meeting August the 18th for chapter 8. So goodbye.